Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itchon, Senior Vice President, and with me is Tim Anaya, Senior Director of Communications.
Happy belated 4th of July, Ro.
Thank you, Tim. I had gone to San Francisco, my first plane trip since the pandemic began. That's about 15 months now. So it was a combination of business and pleasure. I checked out some office space for PRI. So listeners might know that our lease from our 101 Montgomery office expired back in July 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic. So rather than look for offices then, we decided to just wait until the pandemic's over so we could get hopefully some better terms. I headed to the city to look out for some new space. But for the long weekend, the best part was I went to my two favorite wineries in Sonoma, Sojourn Wines, and they specialize in Pinots and Cabs. And I also went to Bedrock, which specializes in great wines at excellent value. So actually, what I recommend is if you want to take baby steps, going out after the pandemic, I think you should definitely go out wine tasting. Go to Sonoma or Napa or Paso Robles. You can be outdoors. You don't have to leave the state. You can spend money here and support California's businesses. And actually, I have a great idea. When you come out to our gala on October 2nd in San Francisco, it's a Saturday, you could come out a little early, go to Sonoma, go to Napa Valley, enjoy some wine, visit the Redwoods, and make a great weekend out of it. How about you, Tim?
Well, I didn't have nearly as exciting a 4th of July as you did there, but I had a nice barbecue. That's what I always enjoy to do on 4th of July weekend. And it actually was a pretty cool recipe that my mom sent me. Last year, I made one of those American flag cakes that you see that are always so cool looking with the whipped cream and the different berries for the stars and the stripes. Well, this year I made it's basically a 7-layer dip, but it's in that same kind of American flag layout. It was quite good and simple, with the guacamole and beans and sour cream for the stars, and you use blue and red tortilla chips, which blue are pretty easy to find. And at least in our grocery stores around here, red are pretty easy to find too. So that was exciting. And the other thing that I always enjoy on the 4th of July, now where I'm at, there are too many trees around where I can't really see the fireworks from. The main fireworks in Sacramento would be either at Cal Expo or at Raleigh Field in West Sac, but I can hear them. But in Sacramento, you're allowed to buy your own firecrackers, not the one that go off the ground. But so there's nothing more fun than doing that on the 4th of July. Well, I'm sure you've seen it in LA and around here, everybody somehow gets their illegal fireworks. So I love to just sit on the front porch with a glass of wine about 8:30 on the 4th of July until about 10 o'clock. And it sounds like I've moved to Beirut. There's that many explosions going off. And in more recent years, every night after the 4th of July, while people are using up their fireworks, I've moved to Beirut once again. So this year did not disappoint despite alleged crackdown on so-called illegal fireworks. I certainly heard lots of noise going off in the area.
Well, you've got to put your creation on Facebook because I would love to see how that comes out.
Yes, I will definitely do that. It was as pretty as the picture and the recipe that I got.
So for this podcast, we have Glenn Reynolds. Many of our listeners know him from his great columns in Instapundit, but I think our listeners probably don't know that he is actually a space policy wonk. And he has a book out by Encounter Books called America's New Destiny in Space. So Glenn is a law professor at the University of Tennessee, but he also served as executive vice president of the National Space Society and was on the White House Advisory Committee on Space Policy. So Tim, I love space. I grew up watching the Apollo missions. I'm glad that America is exploring space again. And this time it's, not big projects sponsored by the government, but by the private sector.
I found that very interesting. I was very troubled, to see that America kind of took a step back in the space program during the Obama era. And so I was very fascinated to hear his vision of how the private sector is going to take America to new and unheard of heights in space, something that government could never really do. So it's very interesting, for our listeners. I've been, very interested in space since I was a kid. My grandfather was an aircraft mechanic for NASA at Moffett Field in Mountain View. And when I was a kid, we used to get to go to Moffett Field at Christmas time, and they'd have a big party for all the kids and grandkids in one of the big aircraft hangars. And you'd see the big hangar doors open up and Santa Claus would come in on a helicopter. So ever since then, I was fascinated with that. He worked on the Galileo aircraft, not the Galileo spaceship, but the Galileo aircraft, which was a big planes, a series of planes that would fly very high, and they would document things like solar eclipses. They would also have their 1960s era telescopes and cameras, where they would try to document the moon and the planets from up there. So it was, important early work in the space program that he worked on. So I was very interested, with that background, listening to what Glenn had to say.
So, Tim, if you were a multimillionaire, would you pay for a seat to go to space?
I don't know. I would be very interested to do. I mean, it sounds like whatever kind of way you go up there. I don't know if it would be the liftoff would be a pleasant experience, and the landing certainly does not seem like it's a pleasant experience. But I think when you're up there, once you break through the orbit, I think it's probably all worth it. So if there's the space version of the Ritz-Carlton, maybe I might be for that.
Oh, I would definitely be for that. Well, thanks everyone for listening, and we hope you'll enjoy the interview. Welcome to PRI's Next Round podcast, Glenn.
Great to be here.
So our listeners may know that you have a terrific blog, Instapundit, and your writings on topics ranging from law to education to big tech, but not everyone knows about your previous work in space policy. So share with our listeners a little bit about your background and your continued interest in space policy.
Oh, well, that goes way back. Actually, when I was in law school, I published a law review article with a classmate, Rob Murchis, who's now a law professor at Berkeley, on commercial space. And I've worked in that area ever since. In the late 80s, I worked on some legislation, the commercial space launch amendments, that basically helped the commercial space launch industry get off the ground. It was previously pretty much tied down by a regulatory thicket. I published a textbook on space law called Outer Space, Problems of Law and Policy, which has been in 2 editions. And I've written a number of law review articles on the topic over the years. And of course, most recently, I have a new short and punchy book from Encounter called America's New Destiny in Space that just tries to kind of tie together in a very big picture way, sort of where we are, where we come from, and where we're going at what I think is actually a pretty pivotal time in history.
And having just finished reading your book, I highly recommend it to all of our listeners today. So you begin the book by describing 3 phases of space flight. There's a visionary phase followed by a command economy phase. So before we look to where we're at and where we're going, maybe you could give our listeners a short history lesson of where we've come on space policy and the lessons we've learned as we enter this new phase of space flight we're in today.
Sure. Well, the visionary phase, we had sort of proto-science fiction, Lucian's True History, which goes back to the Roman era, where Cyrano de Bergerac's story of traveling to the moon, his protagonist first tries attaching jars of morning dew to himself because it rises into the sky when the sun comes out. This doesn't work very well. So then he tries rockets, and he does get to the moon that way. So I guess it's not completely fanciful. But the first real sort of serious treatment of this was Jules Verne's From the Earth to the Moon in 1867, and much less remembered, a piece published in the Atlantic Monthly by Edward Everett Hale called The Brick Moon, which was about the idea of an artificial satellite to be used for navigation. And people started actually thinking more seriously after this. A real pioneer was Russian Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, who wrote the first exploration of having to operate in zero gravity when you're in Earth orbit, and why that was the case and how you could do it in 1883, and anticipated pretty much all the problems we experience, and speculated about how spacesuits might be necessary. And he wrote a paper in 1903 called Exploration of cosmic space using reactive devices, that's rockets, that spelled out the fundamental principles of orbital mechanics that spacecraft would use and a lot of other characteristics. Robert Goddard got interested in this, and he was the first of the visionaries to actually bend metal. Robert Goddard was a professor at Clark University, and he built the first liquid fuel rockets with some success, although in 1920 he was ridiculed by the New York Times because he had expressed the outlandish possibility that one day rockets like that might actually go to the moon. And the Times published an editorial basically saying that these foolish professors are wasting a lot of money on ridiculous stuff. It retracted that on July 21st, 1969, after men landed on the moon, which is rather long for a retraction, but it is the Times. Goddard's work inspired a number of people, including a German rocket club headed by Werner von Braun and Willy Ley, who were took his work really farther. And Goddard, sadly, was, even though he fought with the New York Times there, he was actually a little bit dispirited by that attack. I think it seems like some of the wind went out of his sails. The Germans were less deterred, and they were building much larger liquid fuel rockets. Although by the 30s, they had gotten to the point where, as Willy Ley said, they couldn't have gone any farther in a private club unless maybe it was a millionaire's club. And they were a little bit at a loss what to do. And that was the point really where the transition from the visionary phase to the command economy phase begins, because they were approached by the German government, which was very interested in funding rocketry research because World War I peace deal, the Versailles Accords, prevented them from researching building heavy bombers and things like that. So they were very interested in rockets and started pumping money into what became the V1 and V2 programs. At the end of the war, the United States managed to scoop up a lot of von Braun's team. Those were the lucky ones. The less lucky ones were scooped up by the Russians. Both space programs were heavily run by Germans, leading to the famous statement, our Germans are better than their Germans. That might not have gone anywhere, except that because of the atomic bomb and because of the Cold War standoff, the Soviets started putting a lot of money into missile research. The United States was mostly interested in rockets as a platform for launching intelligence spy satellites, and indeed was speculating on that as early as 1946 in classified papers. The Air Force took the position that we didn't need missiles to deliver nuclear weapons because we had all those shiny bombers. But after Sputnik was launched in 1957, people reassessed it, since if you could orbit something around the Earth, you can launch a missile and drop a nuclear warhead on somebody. And so as a result, we got a space race going, which was really a sublimated version of the Cold War. It was war by other means and happily constructive rather than destructive means. And in fact, I talked some years ago to Jerome Wiester back when he was president of MIT, and he had been John F. Kennedy's science advisor at the time. And he told me in no uncertain terms that Kennedy absolutely saw the space race as a way of sort of displacing Cold War hostility into a non-destructive conflict. And indeed he did. That said, people were a bit concerned about what happens if you lose. Neither the United States nor the Soviet Union was actually super eager to get to the moon, take it over, and start building missile bases and things like that. But both were really pretty afraid that the other would. So they pumped a lot of money into this until the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, where they basically fixed the race by agreeing that they wouldn't do those things. And that took a lot of the steam out of the space race. We went ahead with Apollo and did our landings, but it's actually interesting. If you look at a chart of spending on space, it peaks and starts to drop off basically right after the 1967 Space Treaty was ratified. But that was the command economy phase, and it did a lot of constructive things. The visionaries had ideas, but they weren't a millionaires club, and they didn't have the resources to make them work. It was easy for the New York Times to make fun of them because there was no way of showing it concretely wrong by a dramatic demonstration. Well, this gave you dramatic demonstrations. We actually sent people to the moon. We launched satellites. We sent probes to other planets. It was obvious that this stuff worked. You never anymore hear somebody say, oh, a rocket can't work in outer space because there's no atmosphere for it to push against. Everybody knows better now. Even educated people thought that well into the 40s and 50s. And so the command economy phase did a lot of good. What it didn't do was make it cheaper to go into space, because command economies aren't any good at that. They're not any good at that when they're in communist countries where the whole economy is a command economy, but they're also not good at it even in a capitalist society where part of its economy is a command economy, as the NASA space programs of the 50s and 60s and 70s were. In fact, the cost of going into space went up over time from the 60s to the space shuttle. People admire a command economy sometimes. I think some of our intellectuals now admire the Chinese for this because it looks very efficient. The big guy on top says do something and it gets done. but there are a lot of costs associated with that. I tell my students that a command economy is sort of the national economy equivalent of steroids. Everybody oohs and ahs at the visible muscles they produce, but nobody sees your shrinking national testicles underneath. And the space command economy did make things more expensive over time because there was no incentive for anyone to make them cheaper. So it did a lot of good things. Without the visionaries, it would have been hard to have the command phase. The command phase then proved that what the visionaries envisioned was in fact practical, could be done, even though it was kind of expensive. But we're now moving into the third phase, the sustainable phase of space development, where costs are coming down, and as costs come down, capabilities concomitantly go up. The space shuttle costs about $55,000 per kilogram to orbit, and Elon Musk, SpaceX's Falcon 9 costs about $2,700 per kilogram to orbit. So that's about a 20-fold reduction in cost. SpaceX's new spacecraft that's in progress, the Starship, is supposed to get that down to around $200 a kilogram. And at that point, you can really do a lot. And you're already seeing some of this. I'm talking to you right now. We're on Zoom. My internet connection is actually from a Starlink satellite, which is a result of SpaceX. They've orbited thousands, soon it's going to be tens of thousands of satellites around the Earth. And those provide internet eventually everywhere. I'm a beta tester. I think I'm literally the only one in Knoxville, Tennessee who has one of these. And I'm getting great service. It's better than my Comcast. Well, maybe that's the low bar, but it works well. It wouldn't be practical to do that at $55,000 a kilogram. You just couldn't afford to launch all those satellites. It is, however, practical to do it at $2,700 a kilogram, which is what they're doing. And lots of other things will be practical at $200 a kilogram or less. So it's really, as I say, I think we're at a real inflection point here.
You sound incredibly crisp and clear, Glenn, like you're next door. So let's talk more about this, what you call this sustainable phase, which you write is, quote, likely to be faster, cheaper, and more sustainable than those that came before, and even more consequential. So explain that, what you mean by that.
Well, I opened the book actually with a quote from, it's a friend of mine, the science fiction writer, Steve Sterling, S.M. Sterling, as he's known. And he posted this on Facebook, really just about the time I was starting the book. Perfect. And his point was that these Starship launches are the equivalent of the caravels that the Spanish and Portuguese launched across the Atlantic in the 16th and 17th centuries. And that it's just a revolution in where the human race is going, and said that I suspect that in the long term, that will be what 2020 is remembered for. The pandemic will be a footnote. And that's true. What else was going on in 1492 that people remember now? Not that much. You know, his argument was this is really the big thing that's going on this year. It's not like we don't notice it, but I don't think we appreciate its importance. And I think that's right. The human species is moving to a set of capabilities we never had before. And those capabilities have the potential, if we use them right, to open up a degree of resources and energy and physical space that we've never come close to encountering before. And I think that's all to the good.
So you mentioned a little bit ago about this great internet service that you are testing. Kind of dovetails the space revolution that you talk about, that the private sector and free enterprise are poised to lead, that does so many great things we can't even fathom, at an increasingly cheaper cost. So you mentioned your internet service. What are some other examples of how private sector space exploration is inspiring new innovation that a government-funded space program could never achieve?
Well, the most important thing is, when SpaceX, and I use it as an example because it's the best known, but there are a number of others. There's Rocket Lab, there's Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin, though it seems to be getting off to kind of a slow start, and several other companies. Unlike a government space program, if they test a rocket and it blows up, they just figure out why it blew up and test another rocket, and it's not the material of congressional hearings. They can afford to fail and to learn from their failures. And they have a very strong incentive to make it cheaper because that's what their customers want. When you are funded by the government, especially if it's a cost plus contract, you really have no incentive to make things cheaper. And as a result, government contractors very seldom do. In terms of what you could do with the technology once you've got it, we have a number of advantages you have when you're in space. The most significant characteristic of space presence that we've used up to now is positional. We have communication satellites and spy satellites and things like that, whose advantage is they're high up above the Earth. The geosynchronous satellites are 22,400 miles high, more or less, and they appear to stay fixed over the same place on Earth, and they're ideal for serving as communication relays and things like that. Spy satellites fly much closer, but they look down on things that you couldn't see any other way. And nowadays, what used to be the sole prerogative of superpower intelligence agencies is now available to anybody who can get on Google Earth. You can see, in fact, stuff that superpower intelligence agencies couldn't see until very recently. Those are the positional tools that we mostly use. There's also energy. People have been working on it for a long time. Solar power satellites that have big solar power arrays in orbit where the sun shines very strongly and all the time, and beam the power to Earth by microwave. They did some experiments on that all the way back in the late 60s, early 70s at JPL Goldstone. But more recently, the Air Force has been actively testing a genuine solar power relay system on its, it's supposed to be secret, X-37 craft, but everybody knows that's what they've been doing because it's been in all the papers. So that's the beginning of what could be very cheap, carbon neutral, non-polluting power for Earth. And the details of that, the engineering details haven't worked out. The engineering overview of it has. People have spent a fair amount of time thinking about how it should work and how the antennas should be constructed and things like that. And then there's physical resources. Even at 200 kilograms or $200 a kilogram, getting things into orbit is still pretty expensive. I weigh about 100 kilograms, give or take, a little less than that. So, but at $200 a kilogram, that adds up. Even if you want to send things like Ziploc bags or toilet paper into orbit, that's $200 a kilogram at best. Anything physical material you can get in orbit has some value because it's already there. We're looking at things like capturing resources from the moon and from asteroids. Not only, you usually hear about precious metals, there are asteroids that contain trillions of dollars worth of platinum. Though, of course, if you brought that much platinum to Earth, it wouldn't be worth trillions of dollars anymore because you flood the market. But probably the most valuable thing are water and gases. You could get oxygen, you can get hydrogen, and then you've got rocket fuel as well as water and something to breathe. You can get nitrogen, various carbons, and those are all very useful in both building things and living in space and in fueling spacecraft to go other places. We now know there's a lot of water on the moon and Mars that we didn't used to know was there. And that makes the prospect of building extensive bases and maybe eventually settlements, maybe not that eventually if you follow Elon Musk's timeline, with adequate supplies of water to let them do a lot of things where it doesn't have to be lifted from Earth. And most importantly, maybe in the long run, you have room. Our planet's pretty small. We just had a pandemic circle the Earth courtesy of international flights from Wuhan in relatively short order. There are all kinds of potentially destructive nuclear and other weapons around. And if you care about the survival of the human species, which I do, having it spread out to a lot of other places doesn't seem like such a bad idea.
So one issue that naturally comes to mind when thinking about our future in space is governance. And think tankers like those at PRI are always talking about governing regulations over what we can do and we can't do. How would it work in space? Would America's laws ultimately govern us when we leave the planet, or would living in space more resemble the concept of seasteading that some of our libertarian friends like to advance here on Earth?
Well, in the short term, American law basically follows the flag. If you're an American flag spacecraft, you're subject to American jurisdiction under both the Outer Space Treaty and under American law. Not very many U.S. laws are applied to people aboard spacecraft. The laws involving crimes on the high seas, for example, apply. Space is part of the special maritime and territorial jurisdiction of the United States, and courts won't apply a law to that unless it's clear that's what the Congress meant for it to apply to that jurisdiction. But if it does, your lawsuits or criminal prosecutions have venue in the District of Columbia, and it's a well-established process. Longer term, how does a space colony govern itself? People will have to decide. Even places that are quite thoroughly governed by U.S. law, like a U.S. Antarctic base, turn out in practice to be pretty self-governing and to operate much more informally than perhaps the people who established them expected. And there's actually been rather a lot of interesting legal and sociological investigation of how those kinds of places work. Longer term, I mean, Elon Musk, the terms of use for my Starlink service say that Earth law doesn't apply if you're on Mars. So what that will be replaced by is something we'll have to figure out later. But obviously, Musk at least is open to the idea of leaving Earth law behind, and I suspect a lot of other people will as well. We saw that, with the colonization of the Americas and particularly the United States, where people came over here originally and they just thought of themselves as Englishmen living somewhere else and subject to English laws, and that was fine for a while. But after a while, they decided that the people making those laws back in London really had no idea what they did or how they lived, and really didn't have their best interests at heart. And they decided to change things. I suspect that will be the ultimate path that space societies take as well. There's been some work on this too. I mean, I was part of a Smithsonian conference on governing societies in outer space back in 1989. And I've published a couple of things elsewhere about it since. And there have been a number of books and conferences and things on the subject. How far we can look ahead to stuff like that at this point, it's a fascinating exercise if you're a law professor like me. But what we really have to say that will be any use to people who are actually living in a lunar colony or on Mars, I would say is fairly limited.
Kind of following up on our discussion a little bit ago about all the abundant energy resources in space, you write in the book about Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk envisioning a life where most industry really operates outside the planet to take advantage of these abundant resources. How realistic do you think this vision is? It sounds like it would be a heck of a commute every day.
Well, we've already gotten used to working remotely now, so I don't think you need to expect a commute. That's not a new idea. Konstantin Tsiolkovsky wrote about it, and Gerard K. O'Neill, the Princeton physics professor, who with a seminar of his basically invented the idea of the kind of space colonies that Jeff Bezos now wants to produce. Bezos is a Princeton alum. Formed this idea too that you've got this beautiful biosphere here, and virtually all the energy and resources of the solar system are somewhere else. So why would you want to do all your dirty, energy intensive manufacturing processes here when you can make the Earth into something more like a park and move those things into space where they are not going to pollute anything that matters and where the materials and energy are plentiful? And it seems fairly persuasive. Obviously, it's not something that will happen in 2030 or 2040, but as a plan for the planet, it seems pretty good. And given that people who are talking about, climate change / global warming today are talking about policies with a timeline of 100 years, it's entirely plausible within a timeline of 100 years.
So we talked about government in space program being inefficient and very expensive. As we look to this sustainable phase and in the future, is there a role for government in space exploration?
Absolutely. And the model I recommend, which is actually, Rob Murgis and I wrote about this in the mid-'80s, and it is kind of happening now. If you look at the early days of aviation, you see the government had two roles that were very constructive. One was with the old NACA, the National Advisory Council on Aeronautics. That was the predecessor of NASA. Did a lot of technical work on things like streamlining and wing design and engines and stuff. And they had what were at the time the biggest wind tunnels in the world at Langley in Virginia. And they generated a lot of technology that the private sector then put into airplanes. At the same time, through the airmail subsidies, the post office was really encouraging people to buy and use better airplanes. They paid you, I don't know if I can say it's inflated, but it was a very remunerative rate to haul airmail. And they paid you more if you could haul it farther, if you could fly at night or in bad weather, if you could haul more of it on a single plane and that kind of thing, which encouraged people to really sort of push the technology curve as far as it could, not only in terms of aircraft, but in terms of piloting and airports and communication and navigation and things like that. It's actually amazing if you read stuff from the early days of aviation about how little pilots knew and how often they got lost. There's a terrific aviation book called Fate is the Hunter by Ernest Gann, who was an early airmail and airline pilot starting in the late 20s or early 30s. And, he did an exhibition flight for the post office where he got lost and had to land and ask for directions. So, they really pushed things up. By just a decade or so later, you had radio navigation around the country, and you had aircraft that could fly hundreds or sometimes thousands of miles and carry much more. And that pressurized aircraft, that was a huge contribution, but it wasn't the kind of government role we had in the Apollo program, where the government basically designed and built its own rockets and launched them. With the help of some contractors, sure, but not in the hands-off way that we did with aviation. What we're seeing right now is something very similar. People mock Elon Musk because a lot of his business is paid for by the government. He's launching military satellites. He's flying people to the International Space Station and delivering supplies and stuff. But he's doing that with the government acting as a commercial customer. It's much more like the airmail subsidies. And they're just one among his many customers there. And I think that's the right way to go. The other thing the government could do more of is some of the technological issues. They're doing some of that. They're doing some work into nuclear space propulsion, which is good. And it's the sort of thing that it's a lot easier for the government to do than for a private company to do. And that's actually very important. The other thing they're doing, looking farther, and this is a policy of the Trump administration that seems to have carried over pretty seamlessly to the Biden administration, is something called the Artemis Accords, which is essentially getting all the countries that sort of have skin in the game in space to agree on some rules for commercial development and resource exploitation in the moon and asteroids and such. And I noticed just today, New Zealand has signed on as the latest of umpteen countries. New Zealand is actually a space power of sorts because Rocket Lab is a New Zealand company, and they've successfully launched a bunch of commercial satellites very cheaply, and they seem to be on a steep growth curve. They're sort of like the SpaceX Junior, but Korea and Japan and a whole series of countries are involved. And the government is trying to sort of open up the path for that to make sure that people who want to invest in this know, essentially, that the U.S. government will have your back if other countries try to interfere.
So let's continue along that line. You write about countries like China that are also advancing their space exploration programs, which obviously is a big concern for both national security and the future of space development. So looking to the future, how should America approach concepts like self-determination and sovereignty and who owns what that, if handled improperly, could lead to future international conflict?
Well, there will be international conflict in space because there's international conflict anywhere that nations deal with anything where the stakes are significantly high. There's no real way to ensure that there won't be international conflict in space except for people not to go into space, which I think would be a poor choice. That said, there are different structures that give people different incentives and make a big difference. The 67 Outer Space Treaty, which basically ended the US/Russian space race, I guess I should say US/Soviet space race back then, by making it impossible to claim sovereignty over bodies. You couldn't, people had the idea that you'd land there and sort of plant a flag like Columbus or something. I claim this for Spain, the United States. That's banned by the Outer Space Treaty. And that seems like a pretty robust norm. There doesn't seem to be anybody trying very hard to get rid of the ban on national appropriation. The Outer Space Treaty doesn't say anything about private property rights. And one of the things in the Artemis Accord is to underscore that private property rights, the ability of a private company to go to the moon and start mining ice or helium-3 or whatever, is permitted and protected. And I think that's good. We also have the no nuclear weapons in orbit. It's actually no nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction in orbit rule, which also seems to have a lot of support. There are propulsion uses for nuclear, they're not really nuclear weapons, they're nuclear explosives that some people have been pretty enthusiastic about, going back to Freeman Dyson, the Princeton physicist, and Ted Taylor, who was the famous nuclear weapons designer. John McPhee wrote a book about him called The Curve of Binding Energy, designed a spacecraft with General Atomics that was propelled by nuclear explosives. And the motto of their project was Saturn by 1970. They started in 1959, and everybody worked on it was sure it would work. They tested a couple of small working models. The Outer Space Treaty doesn't block that. The Limited Test Ban Treaty may, but I'm working on an argument as to why it doesn't necessarily. China, however, hasn't signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty. So if China wants to start building Orion-style spacecraft, that was the name of the project, that are propelled by nuclear explosives, there's really nothing to stop them, and they might. What is going on right now is a genuine space race. It's only recently been really admitted. Bill Nelson, the NASA administrator, just this week came out and kind of made that plain, where they've been sort of pussyfooting it around it. But the Chinese are very serious. The Chinese believe that they are destined to expand, and expansion on Earth is geographically and politically awkward for them. they believe that people who are used to being crowded together in small spaces and following rules, which is at least how the Chinese conceive of themselves, actually will do better in space than Americans who are like more space and aren't as orderly. Though whether the Chinese are as orderly as all that is, I think, questionable. And they see it also as just the source of power for the 21st century. So they are quite eager to establish control of resources and bases on the moon and in other places. And they're launching stuff all the time. And they recently put up their own space station. So the United States and Russia and other countries have the International Space Station. The Chinese are like, yeah, big deal. We got our own. So, they're very serious about it. And the United States government, and this also is interestingly something that's carried over pretty seamlessly from the Trump administration, seems eager to meet that challenge. So we may well be in for a second space race. In fact, we're really already in one.
So as we close, let's look ahead. What policies or policy changes do you think the U.S. should embrace to ensure that America leads the way in space and fulfills our great potential?
Well, honestly, the good news is we're really in a pretty good place. We've had good policy through really the last two administrations. The Obama administration was actually surprisingly good on both governmental and commercial space. Indeed, Obama signed a bill in 2015 that recognized the right of U.S. companies to extract space resources and really laid the foundations for the Artemis Accords. The Trump executive order that started the Artemis process was really just implementing that act. So that's good. The regulatory structure has been pretty good. The FAA has had trouble dealing with SpaceX because SpaceX is just so fast. They're just inside the FAA's OODA loop. They can make decisions and implement them faster than the FAA can even understand what they're doing. And that's led to a little conflict where SpaceX finds a problem, fixes it, and does another launch. And the FAA is responding, whoa, you've got to let us investigate that explosion before you can launch another rocket. And SpaceX is like, why? We know what happened. We fixed it. That, I think, that seems to be being addressed, though it may call for legislative changes, but it may not. We're seeing a certain amount of lawfare right now mostly by competitors. I hate to keep talking about SpaceX, but they're just really at the cutting edge of all this. They were outrunning everybody. A number of their competitors are starting to try to block them using the FCC or the FAA or Jeff Bezos has a contract protest for a launch deal for moon trips that SpaceX got. I don't think that's a good thing. And I think we should do our best to make sure that our regulatory structure makes it hard for people to use the legal apparatus as a competitive tool. You're always going to have some of that. And hey, I'm a law professor. My job is to sell law degrees. So I suppose I should be all in favor of that. But I think that's something to watch. The government's program of acting as a commercial customer should probably be expanded. I would like to see more money in R&D for technologies related to sort of the next stage of space stuff, which is like constructing large structures in space, asteroid mining. We have some of that already. We've done some missions to check out asteroids and bring back samples and see what they're made of and what they look like and how to rendezvous with them. But I'd certainly like to see more on that. And for that matter, more on the moon and Mars. We're doing sort of all the stuff we should do. So I guess one of the main things I want is really just more. And I'm happy to be in that place. And I will say, I wasn't dreading the Biden administration on the space front because I had hopes that it would be fairly bipartisan, but you never know. But so far, at least, they've been fine. So I'm hoping that will continue.
So finally, we call our podcast Next Round because of PRI's proximity to wine country and our love for discussing public policy while enjoying an adult beverage. So what beer, wine, adult, or otherwise beverage are you enjoying while thinking about America's great potential in space?
Well, at the moment, I hate to burst your bubble, but it's just water. However, I am very partial to products of a couple of products from some of my students. I'm in Tennessee. Several of my former law students are actually distillers now. It turns out, this sort of goes to my lawfare point, I guess, but it turns out operating a distilled spirits business is so heavily regulated that having a law degree is a huge competitive advantage. So I will later tonight be having either a Tennessee Black and Tan, which is a grain whiskey, or a Tennessee bourbon, both of which are made by my former student Heath Clark at his H. Clark Distillery, an artisanal distillery that distills this stuff literally one barrel at a time, although he's just cut a deal to build a gigantic commercial distillery as well. So that's what I shall be having. He makes a hell of a gin, too.
Well, that was a very interesting interview. Thanks so much for joining us, Glenn.
Thanks so much for having me.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.